Welcome to another episode of The Village People Talking, a Gen Z's perspective. Here we explore Africa's past, present, and future. Today we're tackling a thought-provoking question. Is democracy the best form of governance for Africa? We'll challenge the common belief that democracy is the ideal solution for the continent and consider whether Africa might have been better off without the imposition of Western democratic systems. To guide our discussion, we'll draw from Walter Rodney's influential work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I'm your host, Eddie, a Nigerian but based in Amsterdam, and my co-host, Yemi, also Nigerian but based in Lagos, Nigeria. Welcome, Yemi.
Okay, so when we think about how Africa has developed as a continent, right?
Yeah.
There's this big question that comes up, right?
Yeah.
Was Western-style democracy, the model that's been pushed and adopted in so many places, was that really the right fit for the continent?
Yeah, it's a massive question, isn't it?
Huge question.
And it gets right to the heart of how nations develop and govern themselves, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah.
So think of this deep dive as exploring a different angle on Africa's political journey.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be looking at the impact of colonial rule on systems of governance, and we're going to do that through the lens of a really important book.
Yes.
How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney.
It's a classic text.
It is a classic, and it really challenges you to rethink a lot of assumptions.
It really does.
So let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Rodney's argument is so fascinating because it goes beyond just saying, colonialism extracted resources from Africa.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying it actually fundamentally changed the course of Africa's own political and societal development.
Yeah, it disrupted it.
It disrupted it, yeah.
At a very fundamental level.
So before we get into that disruption,
Yeah.
let's rewind a bit.
Mm-hmm.
What did governance actually look like across Africa before Europe showed up?
Right. So it's crucial to understand that Africa wasn't this empty political space, just waiting for a system to be imposed.
Mm-hmm.
It was incredibly diverse,
Yeah.
with all sorts of sophisticated governance structures already in place.
So we're talking about well-established system.
Oh, yeah. You had these vast empires like the Kingdom of Mali,
Right.
the Oyo Empire, each with their own complex ways of organizing power and society.
Yeah.
But then you also had more decentralized systems,
Maybe.
like those found in some Igbo communities, for example,
Mm-hmm.
where decision-making was much more kind of distributed across different levels and groups.
So a real mix.
Huge diversity, yeah.
So within all this diversity, were there any common threads or principles that kind of guided these pre-colonial systems?
Yeah, definitely.
What was important to the people living under them?
I think a big one, a really common thread, was this emphasis on the collective good.
Okay.
So decisions weren't just made for individual gain.
Yeah.
They were often made with the well-being of the whole community in mind.
The whole community, yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
For example, land in many pre-colonial African societies
Mhm.
was often held communally
Okay.
rather than being owned by individuals.
So very different from the Western
Exactly.
concept of private property.
Yeah, and it's really vital to remember, as Rodney points out, that these pre-colonial systems weren't static relics of the past.
Right.
They weren't just frozen in time. They
Yeah.
were living, breathing, evolving systems. They were constantly adapting to internal dynamics and, interactions with neighboring societies.
So dynamic systems.
Very much so, yeah.
Okay, so you have this dynamism, you have these existing frameworks in place, and then colonialism arrives.
Right.
How did that arrival fundamentally disrupt these indigenous approaches to governance?
Well, it was a massive upheaval.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about, new flags and anthems here.
Right.
The introduction of Western-style governance was a huge imposition.
Okay.
It brought in concepts like private land ownership,
Yeah.
this idea of individualistic competition, and parliamentary systems based on majority rule.
Right.
And these were often completely alien to the existing communal structures
Yeah.
and consensus-driven decision-making processes that were already in place.
So clashing.
Yeah, hashing.
Head on in a lot of ways.
And Rodney's argument is that this imposition, essentially derailed Africa's own political self-determination.
Right.
It didn't allow these existing systems to continue to develop along their own path.
So this idea of democracy then,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't something that naturally emerged from within African societies.
Not really.
It was more like an import.
Exactly, and import a transplant.
Like something brought in from the outside.
Yeah, the kind of Western democracy we often see in African nations today,
Yeah.
it was largely implemented by colonial powers, often right around the time of independence.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't even necessarily like something that came about after
Yeah,
a period of, independent development.
yeah, it was often part of the package deal of independence.
Wow. Okay.
You know?
Interesting.
And think about those colonial borders, too.
Yeah, those arbitrary lines drawn on maps.
Exactly. Lines drawn in Europe, that just carved up existing communities and societies.
Right.
And that made it much harder to build cohesive political units after independence.
Yeah.
Units that might have, over time, developed their own unique forms of governance.
Had they been given the space and the time?
Exactly. Africa was, in many ways, kind of shoehorned into a foreign political model.
Right, right. So given all of that, what were some of the consequences of this imposed democracy?
Yeah, well, that's a key question, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, did it, magically lead to more stability or better outcomes?
Well, Rodney would argue no.
Okay.
He suggests that these imposed political systems were often designed more for maintaining control.
Control.
Yeah, control over resources,
Mm-hmm.
control over populations, rather than for the genuine empowerment and flourishing of African people.
So not really about serving the needs of the people.
Yeah, like elections, for example,
Right.
could easily become tools for elites, often those with close ties to former colonial powers, to maintain their grip on power.
So almost like a continuation of colonial control.
In a way, yeah. The priority wasn't necessarily about building truly representative institutions that actually served the needs of everyone.
Right. So it's almost like taking a political system developed in one historical and cultural context
Right.
and just kind of dropping it into a totally different one.
Yeah.
It sounds like a recipe for friction.
Exactly. It often didn't account for the unique cultural, social, historical realities of many African societies.
So in a way, Western-style democracy,
Right.
with its emphasis on centralized government.
Yeah.
And a winner-takes-all approach to elections.
Right.
It often struggled to accommodate
Yeah.
the kind of diversity and the existing practices in many African societies.
Exactly. And Rodney really contrasts that with the pre-colonial systems that often prioritized inclusive, consensus-based decision-making,
Right.
which is a very different approach from the kind of adversarial,
Yeah.
winner-takes-all nature that you often see in Western politics.
Yeah, it makes you think, what if colonialism hadn't happened? What path might African governance have taken?
Yeah, what could have evolved organically?
It's a huge question.
It is a huge question. Yeah.
What might we have seen?
Well, Rodney argues that Africa likely would have continued to develop its own diverse political systems, ones that were much more in tune with its own values and circumstances.
So a different trajectory.
A very different trajectory. His core point, I think, is that Africa would have developed at its own pace, creating forms of governance that truly reflected its unique cultures, rather than being forced to adopt a foreign template that didn't always fit.
Right. And how did this disruption in governance tie into the bigger issue of economic underdevelopment that Rodney talks about so powerfully?
Yeah, they're absolutely intertwined.
Okay.
The disruption of governance was a key mechanism for the diversion of resources.
Okay.
Colonialism needed systems of control. And these imposed political structures provided that they facilitated things like forced labor,
Yeah.
the extraction of raw materials.
Yeah.
And what Rodney suggests is that if Africa had maintained control over its own governance, it could have directed those resources and energies towards its own economic and political development.
Right. So instead of being extracted, those resources could have been used
Exactly.
for the benefit of
African societies themselves.
African people and societies.
And in the process, they could have fostered a more organic and self-determined form of governance.
So in this alternative history where Africa shapes its own governance, what kinds of advantages do you think we might have seen?
That's a really interesting question to consider, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I think one possibility is that self-developed governance might have led to greater long-term stability.
Okay.
And potentially fewer of the internal conflicts that have sadly affected some African nations,
Right.
particularly those that have struggled with imposed Western democratic systems.
Right.
There's also the possibility of more gradual and responsive development, where political systems kind of evolve alongside local needs and traditions.
So organic development.
Exactly, rather than being imposed from the outside.
It makes me think of trying to grow a plant in soil that's just not right for it.
Okay.
You can try your best, but it's never really going to thrive.
Right.
Is that a fair analogy for what happened with the implementation of Western democracy?
I think that's a very apt analogy. Trying to implement a complex system like Western democracy, it requires a certain foundation.
Yeah.
It needs things like established institutions, widespread education, and a degree of cultural alignment.
Right.
And if those underlying elements aren't there, or if the system clashes with existing social norms, it's like planting that seed in poor soil. The conditions just aren't right for healthy growth.
So that brings us to a really important question.
Yeah.
Given all the challenges we've seen with Western democracy in various African nations, why is it still so often presented as the ultimate goal?
Yeah.
The universal solution?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is a big question.
And it's one that Rodney implicitly raises in his work. There seems to be this persistent belief in the inherent superiority or universal applicability of Western democratic models. Even when the evidence on the ground, in many African contexts, suggests it hasn't always delivered the anticipated results.
So the core issue isn't necessarily the principles of democracy themselves, like representation or accountability.
Exactly.
It's more about where the model came from and how it was implemented.
Exactly. That's, I think, a key takeaway from Rodney's analysis.
Okay.
The critique isn't necessarily of democratic ideals as abstract concepts, but of the specific Western blueprint for democracy.
Right.
And the way it was kind of transplanted onto African soil.
Without taking into account.
Without sufficient consideration for the existing political, social, and cultural landscape.
So where does that leave us in terms of thinking about the future of governance in Africa?
Well, I think Rodney's work strongly suggests that Africa needs to critically re-examine its assumptions about governance.
Okay.
And explore models that are more deeply rooted in its own history, cultures, and unique circumstances.
So looking inward as well as outward.
Exactly. Drawing on global experiences, but not just blindly adopting them. It's about finding what truly serves the people of Africa.
And this legacy of colonialism we've been talking about, it's not something that just vanished with independence.
No, definitely not.
It continues to shape things.
Absolutely. Rodney emphasizes that the impact of colonialism is still very much present.
Yeah.
It influences political structures, economic systems, and even the way people think about governance.
So like this long shadow.
It is, And a critical examination of these imposed systems is absolutely essential for charting a more self-determined future for the continent.
So it sounds like we're talking about uniquely African forms of governance as a potential way forward.
I think that's the overarching implication of Rodney's work. The answer he suggests might lie in developing or perhaps revitalizing uniquely African forms of governance that truly reflect the continent's diversity and its long history of self-rule.
Before the colonial interruption.
Exact.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
It really has.
So for our listeners out there, what's the one key takeaway from our deep dive into Rodney's work today?
The core idea is that the imposition of Western democracy in Africa may have actually hindered rather than helped the continent's political development.
Okay.
And his analysis really pushes us to consider exploring and potentially drawing valuable lessons from indigenous models of governance.
So that's something to really think about.
Definitely.
And on that note, here's a final thought for everyone to chew on.
Okay.
Could a deeper understanding and potential revitalization of aspects of pre-colonial African governance offer valuable insights for the continent's future? What specific elements from those systems might hold the key to more stable and prosperous societies?
Lots to ponder there.
It is, and we encourage you to keep digging.
Yeah.
Keep questioning the narratives we're often presented with.
Absolutely.
And keep exploring these vital issues.
It's an ongoing conversation.
It is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
That wraps up today's episode of The Village People Talking. Thanks for joining us. Remember, this is just the start of the conversation. Stay curious, challenge the narratives, and keep questioning what we've been taught. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode with similar discussions.